Hello and welcome to the Infinite Financial Freedom Podcast, where we empower you with financial literacy and guide you on your journey to financial freedom. I'm Josh Mettle, and for the first episode of the Infinite Financial Freedom Podcast, I'm delighted to have my business partners from Neo Home Loans, Danny Hirani, Ryan Grant, and Chris Ledley on the podcast. And as a last second ad, we were lucky enough to get serial entrepreneur David Robnett on the podcast. So this is going to be a blast today. And team, for our first podcast, I want to focus on one of the most powerful wealth multipliers and wealth destroyers, depending on how your finances are situated, that the vast majority of millennials and Zoomers, that's the Gen Z, know astonishingly little about. They haven't seen this in their lifetimes. This economic force has been largely asleep for the last 40 years and appears to finally be waking up today. So if you understand what's happening and position your finances correctly, this can make you very, very wealthy. If you're not aware of what's happening around you, it will greatly impair your financial future. So today, we're going to talk about inflation, how it impacts interest rates, your investment choices, and how you should think about your home loan going into potentially a much, much higher era of inflation than any of us have seen in our lifetimes. So gentlemen, welcome to the show. And before we jump in on this discussion about inflation, how it impacts our finances, and ultimately our ability to create wealth, I'd like to have each of you just quickly share your why as it relates to the Infinite Financial Freedom Podcast and why we do what we do at Neo Home Loans. Danny, why don't we start with you, brother?
Thanks, Josh. Super stoked to be here with you today. And, my why for being here on the Infinite Financial Freedom Podcast really comes down to improving communities through financial literacy. And I was personally touched by great advice that was given to my parents, when I was a teenager, that led them to making better investment decisions, specifically decisions around home ownership. And I firmly believe I wouldn't be here on this call with you today if that advice hadn't been given to them. So I really, truly believe that financial literacy can change lives and change communities. And I'm here today to hopefully share some of that wisdom.
We have a lot of that in common, brother. I'm glad to have you. Ryan, how about you, my friend?
Yeah, I have a real passion around this for a long time, 10 plus years. I've been fortunate to help a lot of families buy and sell and finance their homes. And I never had a significant sense of pride around that because of the fact that it was just that, right? It was helping people acquire debt to access a home. And until, roughly 4 or 5 years ago, when we really started to say, look, we can't just give people debt. We also have to give them growth. We have to help them with education. We have to give them the information and the analysis for them to make competent decisions. And then we have to commit to helping them long-term. So this is right in line with our philosophy of helping people grow their wealth, making smart decisions in real estate, avoiding bad decisions, and saving as much money as they possibly can throughout their life. And so it's definitely something I'm very excited about and looking forward to it.
Amen. Glad to have you. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate you having me on today. So, for me, it's interesting. I look at our society as a whole, and we do such a poor job of educating, the younger generations, or educating in general around financial literacy, building wealth. And it's almost taboo when we talk about money. And so these stereotypes get built up, as in, the media portraying wealth is material, right? And all we're doing is ingraining these terrible practices that actually do the opposite of help people build wealth. And so, I look around at friends of mine and families that I knew growing up, and watching them have no real plan to a goal at the end of the day that would give them financial freedom. And so this really gives us the opportunity to impact so many people's lives through financial literacy, by showing them that it is attainable, that we can create a path that puts them on the right track to get to that point down the road that gives them the freedom that essentially we all have the right to.
Hey, Dave, thanks for coming in last minute and joining us. Love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Josh. Super excited to join this group today. What a powerhouse group you've put together here. And really excited to talk about this topic as well, because we've not only got so many clients that depend on us, to help them with their financial futures, their education, their financial literacy. But we've also got a lot of team members that we work with, and we've all been really fortunate to help work with those team members and help provide them advice and guidance to help with their financial education, literacy, and over the long term. I even go back to my childhood with my parents, owning businesses for 30 or 40 years, back when they're in times where there were massive amounts of inflation, say 16 or 18% per year in some cases, and helping their team members that they worked with for years and years navigate those much rougher waters than what we've seen in, like you said, the past 30 or 40 years here.
Well, Dave, that's one of the reasons we brought you on for your expertise. We thought, if we're going to have a show on inflation, maybe one of us should have been born when there was actually inflation. So we're really grateful that you're going to anchor us in reality and not just theory, man. So thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks for making me feel even older than I am, Josh.
Sage wisdom, we need it. Sage wisdom. I'll share my why just real quickly, and some of you, all my partners know this, that I had a rough upbringing with lots of financial turmoil and things like living in a 400 square foot apartment with my single mother for many, many years, buying groceries from the Mormon storehouse, where if you worked for 4 or 5 hours, they would give you a bag of groceries for every hour of manual labor that you put into the storehouse. So that's not really buying groceries. I guess that's trading for groceries, bartering for groceries when you're 8 years old. It was actually a blast. But when I was 11, I'll never forget the moment of realizing that my single mother was buying groceries with food stamps. And that was one of those moments where I realized, like, it's on me. Like, I have to figure out if this is the path that I want my family and my kids to continue down, or if I'm going to make a decision to go a different direction. And in retrospect, I'm immensely grateful for that foundation of having no money and having to realize it's all on me to figure it out, because it was kind of one of those lines in the sand where you're going back or you're going forward. And I had just decided, by 12, I think I was watching, CNN, and I was sure that the ticker symbols across the bottom was like the Mandarin code for wealth and money. And that's been about the only TV shows I've watched over the last 30 years. And in closing, last year was a momentous year for me. My mom and I actually started buying investment properties when I was 21 years old. And so for the last 22 years, we've been buying properties. And last year, we paid off 44 rental units, 44, free and clear. And part of the power of paying off those 44 units was what we are going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about eventually here is the inflation-induced debt destruction. And that's what happened to me over the last 23 years of owning real estate. And as my wealth and income went up, the mortgage balance and interest rates, actually the interest rates went down because I refinanced them to lower rates, finally to a point where the income was much more substantial than those fixed interest rates, and we were able to pay those properties off. So anyways, I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to share some of the things that I've learned and to have all my partners here together on our first podcast. So gentlemen, let's move right in. The question that I want to tackle first is, what is inflation, and why, after 40 years of low inflation, are many experts, economists, hedge fund managers now starting to talk about inflation, and that may be the next era ahead? I'll toss that softball up, whoever wants to take a swing.
I'll take the first half of that question, and I'll leave the second half for someone else. But I mean, I think the concept in inflation is hopefully pretty intuitive and familiar. But essentially, what inflation is the lowering in value of dollars over time, or said differently, the diminishment of purchasing power, or the reduction of purchasing power over time. So if you have a good or service that costs, let's say, $10 today, the expectation is that in the future, that same good or service will cost more, not because the value of that item went up, but because the value of the dollars that are used to purchase that item go down. So you need more of those dollars to then purchase that same good or service. So who'd like to kind of jump in to introduce why now, after 40 years, inflation's starting to show up again or predicted again inside of the economy?
Yeah, I can take a first pass at that. And so, first off, I think it's important to recognize, kind of as was mentioned, we've been in a downward trend of rates. Inflation has been relatively low for the past 40 years, and there's a pendulum that generally corrects and swings back the other direction. But we've had a unique situation to where, our economy has been shut down, and all of a sudden there's a surge and it's starting to reopen, and we've input all this stimulus funds. So this is additional monies that are being put into the economy. And so when that happens, that's going to increase spending, right? And so when that happens, you see demand that goes up due to supply. And when there's a supply and demand issue, essentially you create inflation because of that.
Yeah, well said. Ryan or Dave, you got something to add to that?
I think the one thing to consider too, Josh, is that, as we're talking to people about their financial freedoms, we would typically use the rule of 72 just as an approximation for how fast people can double their wealth or their income. And if people haven't heard of it, the rule of 72 is basically a shortcut or a rule of thumb to estimate the number of years required to double your money at a given annual rate of return. Or in this case, if we're talking about inflation, we could be talking about the number of years where their purchasing power that Danny was talking about could be cut in half. So just as a quick example, if we're running at inflation rates of say 2%, then you're talking 72 divided by 2, 36 years for your purchasing power to be cut in half if your income stays the same. Whereas if that goes up to say 6%, that could, due to the compounding of that, could reduce your purchasing power in as little as 6 years.
Wow, you crushed it. That I hadn't thought of explaining it in that context, but that is exactly what I want to swing back to, Dave, when we get to a few more questions in, and we're going to talk about that term, inflation-induced debt destruction, and that was the perfect tee up for that. So thank you very, very, very much. Along those lines, in the show opening, I mentioned that inflation can be a wealth multiplier, and it can also be a wealth destroyer. So who benefits in times of inflation and who gets financially destroyed depends on where our assets sit. So who wants to take a shot at the people who benefit when we see inflation and the people who get punished when we see inflation?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So in inflationary times, you want your assets to be in appreciating asset classes. So real estate, owning companies, stocks and bonds, making sure that you don't have your money sitting in a checking account earning no interest. You want your money to keep up with at least the inflationary rate, if not exceeding it. So the challenge is if you have mattress money, if you have, if you're not invested in other asset classes that are going to grow, then your dollar becomes less and less valuable over time. And so people that are risk averse and they don't want to invest that money and they want to keep it, they may feel like they're going to have opportunity, but it's going to, as Dave said, 6 years from now, you could be able to buy half of what you could have bought previously.
So I want to just quickly add to that, Josh, with to answer this question with one just kind of high level concept in economics called the real rate of interest. And the definition of the real rate of interest is the interest rate minus the rate of inflation. So an interest rate on a checking account is 0% or 0.025%, whatever your bank is paying you these days. It's effectively zero. And if the rate of inflation is 5%, then your real rate of interest on that checking account is minus 5%. The opposite is true of taking out debt. If your interest rate is 5% and the inflation rate is 5%, then your real rate of interest from that borrowing is 0%. And that applies. So it applies in both directions. And to answer the question about, wealth, winners and losers from inflation, to be really specific about it, people that have assets, as Ryan said, tend to be winners, to simplify it, and people who do not tend to be losers in this. Owners tend to be winners. Renters tend to be losers because inflation impacts rents, but it does not impact fixed mortgage payments. Those that tend to be on the lower end of the financial spectrum will typically get hit harder on a day-to-day basis because the cost of all goods and services goes up with inflation. That means the cost of food, the cost of energy. Look at what's happening right now with gas prices. One of the greatest run up in the price of a barrel of oil in history, happened just recently. And the people that are living in, a paycheck to paycheck type of environment where, an extra $50 at the pump really makes a difference and could lead to choice making in their day-to-day finances, tend to be impacted pretty heavily by inflation.
Yeah, one more point that I'd love to add to that, because when you say the word assets, there's such a broad spectrum that encompasses. And so, I like to think about it in a couple different ways. One is, a finite asset that demand is going to be created around. And that's why you hear people talk about gold. Real estate can fall into that as well. And the other side of it that you want to think about is it either needs to appreciate or it needs to generate income. And that's why real estate becomes such an important component in an inflationary market.
Yeah, it occurs to me, and Dave, I invite you to jump in if you have anything to add here, of course, but it appears to me that the formula for creating wealth, especially coming from, where I came from, was A, live below your means, B, save money, resist the temptation of trying to keep up with the coolest guy around with the coolest car, the coolest clothes, and just, resist that temptation. And then C, find a vehicle that is going to compound over a very, very long period of time in terms of, like you said, pay off dividends, rental income, a business that has cash flow, private money notes, whatever it is, but it creates additional, essentially you're putting those dollars to work and they're creating more dollars. And then sit back and be patient and let that vehicle run for as long as humanly possible. And I share that with you because, there's a couple of very successful professionals that I know that have part of the equation right. They have the live below their means. They're very affluent. They make plenty of money. And then the money sits in their checking account because they have paranoia around making a decision and being wrong. And in the last 40 years, you could maybe get away with that, right? If you're having very little inflation and you're potentially even having years where we have deflation, right? I mean, with technology, and then of course what we had with COVID, I mean, that was certainly a year that cash was the right asset class to hold on to and then lever out into some other investment. But if we are now going into an era of inflation, that person, almost regardless of how high their income is not going to be able to grow enough cash soldiers to comfortably play for retirement because inflation is going to outwork them. So who has anything to add on that line of thinking?
I'll jump in on that, Josh, because I think you're a prime example of someone who is doing a lot of the right things. And as we head into potentially more inflationary times, you don't have money to invest if you don't live below your means. You don't have money to put into appreciating assets if you don't live below your means. So that's where it all starts. For anyone listening that is trying to keep up with the Joneses and buying new cars every year, maxing out their house, it is something where, as we head into times like this, where, as I said earlier, even if inflation just creeps up to say 4, 5, 6%, not back to the 12% it was in the late 70s, early 80s, or the 16 or 18 or even 20% it was in the 40s and 50s at times. You're going to have assets available in order to invest, in order to keep up with the rate of inflation and not be losing the race to inflation.
Great point, Dave. It just made me think, to Josh's point, I almost think the person in the greatest danger right now is the uninformed saver. the person that thinks that they're in a great place because they have a good reserve, a good nest egg in a savings or a checking account, but it is going to be so diminished by inflation that they're actually losing money year over year over year. And that's a dangerous place to be in.
And what about, so that counts for people that have the money in their money market account, in their checking account, thinking they're being very safe and very prudent. It also counts for people that are invested in US Treasuries, local state municipal bonds that are, all in the 1.5% to 3% range. I mean, a 3%. So for example, in the state of Utah, they have a great municipal bond fund, and the average yield is over 3%. The default rate is so minuscule, it almost doesn't even happen. I would say it's, as safe as a US Treasury, and it's over 3% and it's tax-free income. Like, that was not a bad play for somebody who is, later in their years over the last 10 years, because we haven't seen much inflation. But to Dave's point, if this thing gets really out of whack, well, let's just say it doesn't get really out of whack. Let's just say it goes to 5 or 6%. Well, if inflation is 6% and you're only making 3%, you're losing 3% of your nest egg every year. And that doesn't include withdrawals. It's just gone. Your purchasing power is gone. But what if it goes to those, historically crazy rates where we're talking about 18%? Can you imagine 20% of your life savings evaporated in 1 year because you were in such a conservative asset class there that didn't keep up with inflation? That's discouraging. That's a scary thought. The other thing that I'll add, and we'll move on, is, the question was who gets punished and who wins. And we talked about the asset classes that win. So real estate, utilities our companies are very inflation proof because they can continue to raise the cost of utilities. Commodities, Danny talked about gas, oil. What about lumber? We're in the real estate business. Lumber's up over 100%, I think, over the last year. So those are all really good. The other person who actually benefits from inflation are debtors. And I'm not talking about people that have short-term debts, like, a credit card or even something up to a 5-year term. But if you have 30-year debt on a mortgage, maybe long-term debt on some sort of a business investment, you have to realize that tomorrow's dollars are going to be less valuable than today's dollars. So in an inflationary environment, you want to lock the interest rate and spread that debt as far into the future as possible. Because as Dave pointed out earlier, if we see 6% inflation in 10 years, that would mean that the dollar is 60% less valuable. Wouldn't you want to pay back that debt at 60% less valuable dollars, because there's more money floating around the economy at that point, and it's a lot easier to pay that money off? So that's the other person who benefits in an inflationary environment. And it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that as the US national debt hits, unbelievable trillions of just completely out of any realm of being able to be paid back with today's value of dollars, the only way to really pay that back is through default or inflation. So I'm not saying that, I agree with this, but the reality is the game we're playing is inflation is the way for the US government to help get out of their debts. And we can use the same advantage to our financial situation if we understand what inflation does to long-term debts. Any comments there?
I'll jump in here, Josh, because this is something that a lot of our listeners will have a choice on. Many people, if they are living below their means, will have excess cash that they're generated, and they have the potential to either pay down a mortgage or invest. And if we get back into inflationary times and you have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage that starts with a 2 or a 3, and you're able to earn a 6 or 8% return on investments in a fairly safe manner due to inflationary pressures again, then that's an arbitrage that you can play and make, in that case, and using those numbers, 3 to 5% a year on your money.
So let's just get real tactical on this real quick. I talked earlier, I brought up the words inflationary induced debt destruction. And that's really what we're talking about here. But let's move from a philosophical approach to a tactical approach. If we believe there's a high chance that we're going into an inflationary period, and by the way, if you've been reading Ray Dalio's letters on LinkedIn, if you read Warren Buffett's annual shareholder letter, they're talking about this, this 40-year swing of low inflation, and the pendulum goes as far as it goes, and then the pendulum swings the other way for 40 years, and you start to see inflation. So some of the brightest minds in the world are anticipating higher inflation rates, and we're already starting to see it. So let's get tactical. If we believe that we're going to see inflation, how does someone take advantage of inflation-induced debt destruction? What are a couple of tactics?
So I'll start and I'll set the stage on this. And, there's a lot of bad advice out there around pay off your mortgage as quickly as you can, or refinance down to a 15-year fixed rate mortgage, which again, essentially is putting the same thought process in it to pay it down as quickly as possible, when in fact, that's just a sales tactic to entice with a lower rate. So here's the way we want to think about it. We've used the concept, or we brought the concept up of $100 today is going to feel like less in the future. And so the way that I really bring that into context is, if you pull up the average starting salary for a police officer in 1990, it was $22,000. Today in 2021, the average starting salary for a police officer is $67,000. That's a 300% increase over that period of time. So would you rather pay back debt with your $22,000 a year salary, or would you rather pay it back at some future point at 44, 55, 67, whatever that number is? And again, this is starting salaries. We're not even taking into consideration career growth and progression, which also will increase your earning power. And so the concept around this is, again, by spreading out that debt over a longer period of time, you effectively are paying back with less valuable dollars, meaning it feels less impactful to your bottom line. Anybody want to walk a little deeper on that example there?
Well, I want to introduce two other ideas to this aspect of the conversation. So one is the power of compounding value, and the power of that real rate of interest, and the concept of relativity. So Einstein called compounding interest the eighth wonder of the world. And so when it comes to investing, and as Dave and Josh both alluded to, living below your means, and then making sure to place that excess capital, that freedom that you've created for yourself to make choices, into an appreciating asset of some kind. If you actually look in the same way that police officer, right? Their ability to generate income is itself an asset, right? You're your first asset. You're your first income generating vehicle, yourself and your wages, right? Wage growth is a compounding event, right? Because that 22,000 becoming 67,000 happened gradually over time, and there was escalation. The same thing happens with other invested assets. And just knowing that buy and hold strategy and that tactic of finding investment vehicles that appreciate and letting those investments sit and grow slowly over time, it's a get rich slow scheme. And so then, as it relates to the idea of relativity, don't let the headlines fool you, right? If something, let's say there was an opportunity to invest and interest rates were 6%, and to borrow, and you know that your brother-in-law or sister-in-law or whoever it is that you have that rivalry with had a 2.5% interest rate, and you're emotionally attached to the fact that your number is higher than theirs, but you're getting it at a time where inflation is higher. You could end up being at exactly the same economic place from a real rate of interest perspective, borrowing at 6% in a 6% inflation market, as a person who borrowed at 2.5% in a 2.5% inflation market. So recognizing relativity, and don't let the power of the headlines paralyze you in your decision making as you're kind of moving forward into this new world.
Yeah, and I see this this mortgage payment chart pulled up here. Before we dive into that, I was just thinking about where to invest in an inflationary time frame. Obviously, we deal in mortgage and real estate. And one of the great things about real estate and in an inflationary time period is you kind of have a double win, right? Because not only do real estate prices increase, so the resale value of the property will increase over time as inflation happens, but it can also be used to generate rental income. So just as the value of the property is going to rise, the amount that tenants will pay in rent can increase over time as well. So, if the owner is generating income through investment property, then ultimately it helps them keep pace and with any general rise in price across the economy. And so I think that's just when people are thinking through and there's multiple different asset classes, but you can even invest in real estate investment trusts and other areas if you don't want to be a general owner of real estate. But thinking through real estate, commodities, and other things, I think is really helpful. But in relation to real estate specifically, and how a mortgage can be a hedge against the dollar in an inflationary time, team, if you guys want to walk through this chart, that could be helpful.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll be, I'm aware that some of the people are going to be on a podcast and won't be able to see the visual, but I'll try to just hit the highlights and walk through it. So this is an example exactly of inflationary induced debt destruction. And of course we did this example, by the way, this kudos goes to Jason Hartman, who came up with that term, by the way. He coined, I believe he trademarked that term. And also this page can be found on his website. So thank you for the insight, Jason. We hope to have him as a future podcast guest. But essentially what he did was he took a period of higher inflation, starting in 1972 and then going for the next 30 years until the loan was paid off. And he showed an amortization chart, and then he brought into the amortization chart the value of the dollar due to inflation. And what's important for people to understand when they think about inflation is that in an inflationary environment, there is wage growth. So your income is going up at a faster clip in an inflationary environment, similar to like what Chris talked about with the revenue of the firefighter. So in this example, it talks about in 1972, the average home sale price was $18,267. This individual took out a $14,614 mortgage at a 7.37% interest rate on a 30-year term. Their mortgage payment was $100 a month. And, let's just assume that their monthly income was about $300 a month at that point, and that they were at a 33% debt to income ratio. Well, what this breakdown illustrates to us is that as the value of the dollar goes down, the income, your wage inflation goes up, the ability to make that payment feels easier year after year after year, because the interest rate is fixed unless you refinance to a lower rate at some period. But the interest rate, the cost of the money is fixed. But what's variable is the value of the money. And as we have inflation and wage growth and more money coming in, it is easier and easier to repay the debt. And as you get to if we just look at year 16 through year 30, you now get to a place where instead of feeling like you're making a $100 payment, it feels like you're making a $38 payment. And at the final year when the loan is paid off, when we account for inflation over those 30 years, it doesn't feel like you're making a $100 a month payment. It feels like you're making a $23 a month payment. And so Jason goes on in the bottom of this to show that in real dollars over the life of the loan, in nominal dollars, that's the actual dollars that left the checking account, there was $36,318 in interest over the life of the loan. That's how many dollars left the checking account. But once you account for inflation over those years, the real dollars adjusted for inflation was only $16,393. And then they had $12,655 in tax deduction. So, the point of this is, and I think, to really bring this home, I think what we're all getting at is if we believe that tomorrow and next year and 10 years and 15 years dollars are going to be diluted and less valuable and more plentiful because of wage growth than today's dollars, then the recipe team, and come in and let me know what you would add to this, but the recipe appears to be stretch your liabilities out as far as humanly possible. And I'm not talking about, go overspend on a car or go overspend on a boat. I hope that everybody is driving to be, completely debt-free, other than maybe your student loans completely debt-free. But in the near term, I'm really talking about student loans, a business finance loan, a mortgage, something that is productive in terms of your economic viability. So we want to stretch those things out as long as humanly possible. Longer payment terms means more cash flow. That hopefully means more savings. And then invest that money, those savings, into asset classes that will keep up or outpace with inflation. So if you're doing that and then you're just keeping money in your savings or bonds, you're going to get destroyed with inflation. If you're doing that and you're investing in real estate, you're investing in a business, you're investing in commodities, you're investing in gold, maybe you have a little bit of money in Bitcoin. Don't put all your money in Bitcoin. That's gambling money. That's Vegas money. Have a little bit of fun, but be careful. If we're putting our nest eggs in inflation indexed assets that are going to outpace inflation, and you're stretching your long-term debts out as long as possible, I think you're going to do exceptionally well through this inflationary period. Team, what would you add?
And Josh, with that, as we head, again into a time where inflation could be creeping back in, reminds me there was the government, the U.S. Census Bureau did a study 4 or 5 years ago. And the two biggest determinants of household wealth were one, did you own a home? And two, are you contributing to retirement accounts? And this applies more in an inflationary environment than ever before. With owning a home and having a mortgage, you have an implied option to refinance your mortgage at any given point. Even if we enter inflationary times, we typically don't see inflation go up or go down in a straight line. So if we're able to finance a house today at, call it 3 or 3.5%, you may get an opportunity to refinance that to an even lower rate at some point in the future. Even if you don't, it's kind of a win-win scenario, because if inflation creeps back up, as we just talked about, your purchasing power and the amount of those payments is actually coming down due to the inflationary pressures that are causing your wages to increase. So it is truly a win-win scenario. So if people are owning a home and maxing out contributions to their retirement accounts, that's exactly where I would suggest they start.
Yeah, that's a great point. The one other thing, the example that we were walking through, and I think it becomes even more powerful, we walked through an example of an owner occupied or our primary residence. But I think we really, really need to think about how much this exponentially compounds if it's an investment property. And the reason why is, in that same example, let's say that the renter that we had in that property with my $100 a month payment was $100 a month that renter paid, right? So it covered my mortgage. I was a little bit of a loss on my taxes and insurance. Well, over time with inflation, rents increase at a similar pace. And so let's fast forward 10 years from now. Well, 10 years from now, my tenant is now paying $200 a month instead of that $100 a month. So not only are they covering the entire principal and interest payment, they're covering my taxes and insurance, and I actually have positive cash flow on it because of the fact that my 30-year fixed mortgage was exactly that. It was fixed while the income I was receiving from that property increased due to inflation. So I think that that's where you get the real ninja move, if you will, as far as how you can compound your wealth during an inflationary market.
Beautiful point. Yeah, well said, Chris. Ryan, did you have something to add, bud?
Yeah, so thank you. For anyone listening to this, I think the key is to understand what you specifically need to do. And that's where most people are challenged. They can read the headlines, they can, watch the news, they can listen to the pundits, they can even listen to shows like this. And then they can say, well, okay, I think I should do this, that, or the other, because that's kind of what I heard. The key is to work with a group of people or a team that will do an analysis on your specific situation, because not everybody needs to attack this inflationary time period the same way. So everybody needs to look at this and say, is there an opportunity for me to invest in real estate? Should I take my mortgage from a 15 to a 30 year? Should I, invest in a certain asset class? Should I divest from a certain asset class? And, this is where your financial planner, your mortgage professional, as long as they're kind of a holistic based mortgage professional, this is where they can really help you grow your wealth and make smarter decisions. If the people that you're working with are simply selling you loans or getting your money that you're investing with them every month, and you don't really have a strategy around, or you haven't talked about how this new shift in monetary environment has changed, then you may be missing out. So seek wise counsel, work with people who are going to give you great advice and guidance, and count on those people to help you do the right things.
Well said, bud. Well said. Very well said. I'm going to just add this last kind of button on this part of the conversation, and then I'll ask them a very final question for everybody. I just sketched out a triangle as Chris was talking, excuse me, and I'm calling it the golden triangle, and this is coming to me in real time, so bear with me here. But if you envision a triangle and the 3 points of the triangle, I believe that this is ultimately one of the most powerful means to achieving multi-generational wealth ever. And I think that rich families have and wealthy families have really figured this out. And the rest of us sitting around with money in our checking accounts, hoping magically somehow there'll be enough money in Social Security for us, haven't. And so let me try and make it as abundantly clear as possible. If you look at it, if we think of this as a triangle in regards to real estate, as Chris was saying, we have three things working for us with investment properties in an inflationary environment. The first one we talked about is the inflation-induced debt destruction. So let me just make that super abundantly clear. If I borrow money on a home at 3% interest, and then inflation is at 6%, that mortgage liability, what we normally think is a liability, is now an asset. Now, why is that? That's because inflation is eroding the value of the debt faster than the interest. So if we have a 6% inflation rate, each year the value of the debt goes down by 6%, and you're only paying 3% interest. How many years do you want to do that for? Like a bazillion, as many as you can get that deal. So you've got inflation-induced debt destruction working for you, eroding the value of the debt faster than the pace of interest. That's one point of the triangle. The other one that Chris mentioned was appreciation. The home value is going up. Now let's assume that we have inflation and we have wage growth. That's going to make buying homes more affordable. And we're going to likely see appreciation. Real estate did astoundingly well during inflationary times. And then the one that Chris hit on is really the one that was the key to me paying off myself and my wife and my family, paying off 40, I think we paid 43 or 44 rentals off last year. And that was the rise in rents. So when the first property my family and I bought together, I was 23 years old. We bought an 8-plex. And the average rents on those 8 units right by the Capitol in Salt Lake City, the average rents were $285. Fast forward 20 years later, the average rents in that unit are over $1,000. It's like $1,300. So I've had all of those things working for me. Inflation-induced debt destruction, although at much lower inflationary levels. I've had appreciation, and instead of bringing in, 8 times 3, $2,400 a month in rent, now we're bringing in $10,000 a month in rent. But my mortgage balance and my mortgage payment is the same. So that golden triangle, I think, is what we've all been kind of describing. I just wanted to put a button on that. Anything anybody would add to that thought process? All right, we'll all go get golden triangle tattoos when this podcast is over. Last question, guys, and we're gonna wrap this up. I've read a lot of books on personal finance, wealth, how to make money. What is money? Should I feel dirty about money? All of those both sociological or mental hangups, as well as the actual accumulation and savings and growth. So let's end with your favorite financial book. What's the one book, if you could only give one book to your children about finances and wealth accumulation, which one would it be?
Mine would be Richest Man in Babylon.
Love that.
I'll take an oldie but a goodie, The Millionaire Next Door.
Great book.
That's a good one. Yeah, mine was Rich Dad, Poor Dad, because it just changed my perception and outlook in the way I viewed savings, spending, investing.
And for me, Josh, actually, Ryan, I was going to go with Richest Man in Babylon as well, but I'll add another one that's kind of second place, which was Tony Robbins' book, Money Master the Game. Offered a ton of tactics that I implemented pretty quickly that made a pretty big difference for my family.
Yeah, I love that book too. That was a great one. It's a solid read. You all took some of my favorites, so I'm going to go with Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, which isn't just a money book, but it is definitely a mindset book, and one that I would recommend for everybody. Team, thanks a lot. This is hugely valuable. I think we are on the forefront of thinking through this and helping our listeners position themselves and at least be aware that so-called safe money in checking is no longer safe. It is at risk, and be aware of what's going on with inflation and the devaluation of the dollar going forward. So team, thanks so much for joining me today for the very first episode of the Infinite Financial Freedom Podcast. You guys are epic, and we're going to call it a show with that. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for listening to the Infinite Financial Freedom Podcast. Subscribe to us on Apple Podcast and Spotify to be notified of all future episodes, and follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. If you'd like to learn more about Neo Home Loans and how we empower homebuyers with financial literacy and guide you on your journey to financial freedom, visit neohomeloans.com.